So Jenny Stevens came to UVM last fall, and she holds a position that focuses on energy and energy systems, and she's been an absolute terrific addition to the faculty here. She is going to tell you about her work, and then we're going to break it to 5:15. I know many of you wrote questions down for Jenny, so I'm really going to give plenty of time probably for you guys to ask some of those questions. So let's give a warm energy alternatives. Welcome to Jenny.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. And thank you, Richard, for inviting me. This is a really great course that you're in to be able to get such exposure to so many things that are going on with energy at UVM and in Vermont and broader. So what I'd like to do today is really kind of set the stage with kind of a big picture view of energy systems transitions and kind of help give the kind of global context for the rest of the speakers and the rest of the things you're going to be talking about throughout the whole semester. And I titled my talk, Energy Transitions, Evolution or Revolution? So this is really this question of, are we talking about incremental, small changes, or are we talking about radical shifts and really revolutionary changes? And that one of the key take-home messages of my talk and of some of my research is that different stakeholders, different people, different key actors in the energy systems have different perceptions of change and whether change is going to be revolutionary or more evolutionary. So that's kind of the framing that I've used here. I also wanted to mention I use this same evolution revolution in the title of our book that was published in February on smart grid electric power struggles, and these are my co-authors of that book. And we're riding bikes in Copenhagen at a conference for this picture. So I'll talk a little bit about what is smart grid, because I know that's a term that you may or may not have exposure to. But so what I want to do today is introduce energy transitions and really talk about both the social and the technological change. And then go into some of the research that I do and my research team does, thinking about diverse perspectives on that energy system change. And then some conclusions, other considerations, and some new research and new areas that I think are really exciting to be exploring in this space. So I also just wanted to highlight, this is your syllabus, I guess, for the remaining semester, Mondays coming up. And I'm going to touch on several of the topics that are mentioned, that you have specific experts coming to talk to you about various different parts of this. Throughout my talk today, I'll be highlighting some of these same areas, including connections with Germany, Vermont, climate and energy connections, which Al Gore will be talking about, and thinking about lots of different issues associated with energy transitions in different places in the world, too. So you have a really great, exciting lineup today, for the whole semester. And so what I'd like to do is kind of set up kind of the big picture context to help you be able to think about what all these different more specific cases later on. So I'm going to begin with talking about the link between climate change and energy. And I think we all kind of know in a general level that they're intricately linked. But it's really this, if you think about the environmental science behind climate change, it is the carbon dioxide as the primary greenhouse gas going into the atmosphere that is like a blanket around the Earth that is causing this imbalance in the radiation coming in and the radiation going out, which is causing disruptions of all kinds of climate systems. And so we're seeing already impacts in many places of more frequent intense storms, temperature rising, sea level rising, disruptions of food and water, public health risks, and displacement of people. The migration crisis in Europe is directly related to drought in Syria, a big piece of that, right? And we don't necessarily always make those connections that it's climate disruption related, but many of the disruptions that are happening geopolitically are actually climate related. So, and obviously there's issues of justice and social justice with unequal distribution of the people who are being impacted, and those of us who are very high energy fossil fuel users are contributing more to the problem than many of the people who are being impacted. So climate change and energy are intricately linked, and fossil fuel energy systems are the largest single contributor to climate change. So if you look here, this is just carbon dioxide concentrations going up over the past 150 years, and global energy demand going up. And it's gas, oil, and coal, these three here, that you can see it's the direct burning of gas, coal, and oil for fossil fuel for energy that is causing the increase in CO2 concentrations, which is the dominant greenhouse gas causing climate change. So there's an intricate link there. Energy transitions are justified and needed, therefore, for climate mitigation, but they're also needed to think about for climate resilience, because increasingly now we're feeling the impacts of climate change. We're having disruptions like Superstorm Sandy, where New York City was out of power for several days. And we're increasingly reliant on electricity, right, to do everything. We can't communicate, we can't pay our bills, we can't do all kinds of things if we don't have electricity. So given this shift, we are also really interested in energy system change for resilience and being prepared and having more robust and resilient systems so that we can keep doing what we need to do in our modern society. So I also just want to briefly mention energy and climate policy. Does anyone know the big international climate policy news that's coming up this semester? Paris, yes. So the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is a whole process of 192 countries that ratified the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. The Kyoto Protocol you've probably heard about, 1997 was the first attempt to get countries to commit to reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Copenhagen in 2009 was highly anticipated as hoping to have the post-Kyoto, post-2012 plan for how countries were going to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, but it was very disappointing. And then Paris is coming up in the end of November, beginning of December of this year. And there's optimism that the Paris talks could lead to some international agreement that is binding, because climate risk is worsening and the renewable energy transition is actually more feasible, right? People are seeing, okay, we can actually make progress and shift away from fossil fuels and shift toward more renewable energy. So there's momentum, and it seems more plausible that some real changes can be made. So here I just want to kind of go through what I mean when I say the renewable energy transition. It's basically very simple, thinking about we have had primarily fossil fuel-based energy systems, and we're moving to renewable-based energy systems. And we can think about, a lot of times the focus in a lot of the transition thinking about this is very much focused on the energy supply. We'll substitute our fossil fuel supply with renewable supply. But one of the really important things that I really encourage you all to think about that isn't always thought about as much as it could or should is that changes in energy demand, changes in energy consumption are also required. Renewable resources are very different than fossil fuels, right? And you can't just, it's not a simple substitution. There's going to have to be changes in our expectations and assumptions regarding how much energy we use and when we use it and all of that. So we've gotten spoiled with fossil fuel resources, and we're very wasteful and very inefficient. And there are a lot of ways we could be much more efficient and less wasteful and use renewables instead. So when we think about renewable energy transition, we're not just talking about electricity. We are also talking about heat and transport. And so oftentimes people think about energy as heat, light, and mobility, kind of these three different categories. And on the Energy Action Seminar series for the semester, you have, you'll be touching on this full spectrum, not just electricity systems. Obviously, a lot of the discussion is about electrifying the heat and the transport sector. That's one option, but there are other strategies also. So I think the article that I sent to Richard that I think he sent out to you guys to take a look at was an article by a research group, Mark Jacobson at Stanford University, where they've proposed 100% clean and renewable wind, water, and sunlight, all sector energy roadmaps for each of the 50 United States. So if you look at the appendix, I mean the full document, I think it's over 130 pages, because they actually go through all the calculations and assumptions they made for all the 50 states. But the point that he's making in this paper is that it is technically feasible to be 100% renewable. Within the energy, among energy researchers, that's actually a very controversial statement, because people are very aware of the lock-in and the institutional and technical infrastructural challenges of making that transition, because we already have systems in place that are not renewable, right? So there's this very complicated set of things that would have to happen to switch to 100% renewables. A lot of it is technical, but a lot of it is actually social and cultural and institutional change that is really almost harder than the technical. So that's something that I hope you guys think about throughout the semester. So this paper, this is the Jacobson paper again. It is just showing, this is one scenario, right, of how we could move to 100% renewables in the United States. One of the important things to think about here that I like about this is it shows the projected US demand, business as usual, and the scenario being put forth here is actually a significant decline in total demand. So that incorporates that actually we'd be more efficient, we wouldn't use as much energy, and then we could meet this even with more ease at that point. So I think that's an important point to think about, and whenever you see, I think I have a slide on this later, is be very wary of projections about what's going to happen in the future, because nobody really knows what's going to happen in the future, and there are projections with energy modeling. There are lots of projections about where things are going to go, and things are actually happening faster than many of us realize, and a lot of those projections are almost definitely going to be wrong, right? And so that's something to think about. So obviously there's been rapid growth in both wind and solar. These are just in the past 5 and 10 years particularly, solar just in the past 5 years. So there's huge changes happening in wind and solar deployment, but fossil fuels still dominate. If you look, this is primary energy world consumption with oil, natural gas, nuclear energy, with right here, and coal being this one, right? So the hydroelectricity and renewables is just this little sliver here. So on a global level, fossil fuels still dominate very, very, very much. Yeah, so you add up these ones right here, right? So it's about 12% or so. So that was BP 2014 data, or 2013. So another key point that I want to make has to do with hydrologic fracking, right, that we've all heard about. And what happened in the United States is just in the past decade, this new technology emerged that has allowed energy companies to extract a lot more oil and gas from places that they didn't think they would be able to extract. And it has changed the energy landscape, not just in the United States, but it's had an impact globally. So this has actually been one of the things that you should be thinking about is that the renewable energy transition is new innovations and new things coming up, but it's also moving away from the fossil fuel-based system. So with the advent of fracking, we actually slowed down the renewable energy transition a little bit, because all of a sudden there was more cheap and profitable oil and gas. And it's domestic resource, right? So in the United States, we want to take advantage of that. We have been taking advantage of that, and we've all been indirectly or directly benefiting in some ways. But obviously there's implications of that. So I want to now just introduce and kind of explore this idea of a transition, a socio-technical transition. This is a paper that talks about a figure that shows a transition that happened over 100 years ago from horses to cars, right? So it's obviously thinking about transportation. And when you look at this figure, what does it look like happened? Or what would you speculate if you just saw this figure? How would you interpret what's happening here? Yeah. Yeah, so people were using horses, cars came into the market. As more and more people started using cars, there was kind of a substitution, and people started using fewer horses, and then cars started taking off, right? The interesting thing is, if you read this paper, and you kind of really get into what happened with this transition, is that this figure is a very oversimplification, right? There was actually a lot of things going on at this time. There were concerns about, in urban environments with horse manure, all over the, health concerns about urban environments. There were bicycles were becoming critical, and they actually played a role in encouraging the shift to have paved roads, which actually led to there was intersection there with bicycles and cars and moving away from horses. So there were a lot of things, and there was public transport and trams and people moving to the suburbs that also all contributed. So there's a lot of things happening that led to this transition, and it's not as simple as the figure kind of represents. And so I want you to think about that and kind of internalize that as you think about the renewable energy transition. If we're moving from fossil fuels to renewables, it's not going to be a simple substitution. There are a lot of complicated factors, social, institutional, cultural things going on that are influencing that transition. So when we study socio-technical transitions, we are talking about technology and technological shifts, but we're also talking about policy and regulation. We're talking about how people use technology. We're talking about markets and economics. We're talking about culture, infrastructure, networks of supply and networks of maintenance. So it's actually, there's a lot of different things, and we're really interested in these connections between the social dimensions and the technical change. So I really want to emphasize the importance of thinking about the social and how social factors and social dimensions influence our technological changes that we see. So the main point here is that it's not a simple technological substitution. It's not going to be a clean line, right? And there's some examples where we might actually be going backward a little bit to eventually go forward toward this shift. So that's something else to keep in mind, is that transitions like this are necessarily disruptive, and it's unrealistic to expect them to be smooth, right? Because this is talking about real deep change, and some people and organizations that are currently profiting and like the current fossil fuel-based system are going to resist the change and actually make it hard for that change to happen. So now I want to shift and just introduce quickly what smart grid is. And I know there are people from the smart grid graduate class who are here, so I'll give you a very brief intro to some of my work in that area. In our perception of what smart grid is, it's really just a term to talk about advanced electricity system change. It's a vision of system change, but there's lots of different competing priorities in terms of what specifically it is. There's lots of different justifications for why we need to change the electricity system. And there's lots of different visions of how much social change versus how much technological change is involved. So it's a complicated story. If you're thinking about the technological components of a smart grid, a lot of it is about integrating computers into our energy system so that our electricity system, so we actually know if the power goes out, the power company knows that the power goes out, even they don't have to wait for you to call them, right? Because that's often the way it has been. So there's some, on one level, it's just updating and integrating computers, but it really has to do with electricity generation, it has to do with transmission and distribution, and then also how we use electricity in our homes, in our workplaces, and in industry. And there are lots of different actors involved in smart grid development, including the businesses, regulators, the people who distribute and generate electricity, and the regional transmission organizations that determine how electricity is moved around. So really what is being integrated into discussions of smart grid is a move from societal expectations. What used to be electricity system was all about just being reliable and affordable. We want to keep our electricity system as cheap as possible and as reliable as possible. Those are still very important priorities, right? But we also now want to be efficient. We want to be as resilient as possible. We're more reliant than ever. We're worried about security, and we're worried about sustainability. So there are these new priorities that are creating tensions among the previous priorities, and there are a lot of new expectations and that are needed to be integrated into electricity system change. So now what I want to do is tell you a little bit about some of the research that I do that's related to evolution, this question of evolution versus revolution, and it's really understanding diverse perspectives on energy system change and energy transitions. This figure, and in the book on smart grid, we talk about electricity systems or energy systems in general. Depending on where you are, and how you connect with energy, you're going to have different priorities. So this is the analogy of blind people touching an elephant and not being able to tell what it is, right? Because it depends on where you are and what part of the system you are connecting to. And that kind of is an analogy to how we think about system change and understanding and have the diverse perspectives on energy system change. So one of the things that our research team has done is think about deployment of energy technology as primarily when people are interested in energy policy. They are interested in new technology, how does it work, and how much is it going to cost, right? So people are interested in technical and economic factors. But what we've been doing in our research is highlighting that there are other factors that determine whether or not a new technology will be deployed. And they have to do with environmental considerations. They have to do with regulatory and legal frameworks. They have to do with political factors, like who is promoting this technology and why, who's going to benefit. And they also have to do with cultural connections. How do we feel about the technology? Do we like the idea of wind turbines on our landscape, or do we not, right? There's cultural questions that have a huge impact on how new technologies are deployed. So while conventional research and perspective and policy tends to focus on the technical and economic, there are these other important factors that are really important to consider. So our research team uses mixed methods approach, kind of social science, on looking at these questions. And this is an example of some work we did looking at how wind deployment is viewed in different states in the United States. And we have states with weak climate energy policy and strong climate energy policy. This is Massachusetts and Minnesota. But then we have states with high wind deployment. Minnesota and Texas both have a lot of wind. And Massachusetts and Montana have low wind deployment. And we found, from our research, we found very different things going on in these different states. In Massachusetts, the framing for wind is very cultural, and people were concerned about, this is largely the Cape Wind Project, if any of you are familiar with that. It's a very controversial wind project. In Minnesota, wind deployment is very much a positive thing because it's been connected with rural economic development. Farmers get to lease their land and put up a wind turbine, and so it's kind of win-win, and nobody's concerned about it. In Montana, there's not much wind, and there's not much public perceptions or engagement at all. But in Texas, there's a lot of wind being deployed, huge amounts of wind. But Texas, there's very little environmental framing. It's very economically motivated. And it's because Texas has a culture of energy infrastructure in their state, right? They're used to having oil rigs on the horizon, and if you put an oil rig or a wind turbine on the horizon, it doesn't matter. And they have so much space that the relationship with space is very different in Texas than in other places. So obviously there has been a lot of opposition to renewable energy, often in the siting and deployment phase. And have anyone know what NIMBY is? Not in my backyard. Do you know what NUMBY is? Not under my backyard. That actually came up in some of the controversy about carbon capture and storage, which is the notion of capturing carbon dioxide and storing it underground. I'm not going to talk about that today. But has anyone have any idea what BANANA means? It's an acronym that's related to these two. It stands for Build Absolutely Nothing Anywhere Near Anybody. And that is a phenomenon, right? Like, a lot of people like their space and their place, and they don't want infrastructure or buildings or energy siting or anything near them, right? A lot of us appreciate the place, and we want to maintain the way it has been in the past. But obviously, as the world gets more crowded, and this gets harder and harder to maintain. So I did just want to touch on a little bit on the smart grid research. I gave an example of the wind perceptions research. But one of the things, so let me just, with our smart grid research, we did an extensive set of focus groups in 7 different states. And we talked to people in multiple different kinds of organizations. So in policy, in the electric utilities, in environmental organizations, technology, academic people, and consumer advocates who are, and we asked about smart grid. What do you think smart grid is? Is it evolutionary or revolutionary? What are the benefits? Who are the winners? Who are the losers? We asked these kinds of questions. And obviously we found very different priorities and perspectives among these different actors. The private sector is accountable mostly to shareholders and thinking about the bottom line. Electric utilities are interested primarily in maintaining reliable service and responding to their customers. And the environmental advocates obviously are concerned about reducing carbon emissions and renewable energy and pushing those kinds of advantages of smart grid systems. So there's quite a diversity of different perspectives based on different stakeholders, different groups in who are engaged in energy system change. 2 of the kind of divergences that we found are related to centralization versus decentralization. And this is something that comes up over and over again, in that some people are envisioning large-scale renewable generation with long-distance transmission that's very centralized, whereas others are thinking very much about community-based, local, community-engaged, renewable decentralized systems. And there's it's very different which of those you think is going to scale up and make the most difference.
Germany. I think, right? Very large scale.
Yeah, well, I think there's both, right? Germany has large scale and a lot of large scale, and obviously a bulk of the meeting their goals are going to have to come from large scale, but they also have a lot of community and local and distributed generation too. So it's not necessarily that it's one or the other, right? But some people are prioritizing or kind of envisioning one or the other. And here in Vermont, there's actually a lot of potential for decentralization. And that's what some of the Vermont representatives that you'll hear from may talk about. And so then the other, obviously, is this revolutionary, incremental versus radical change. Different people we talk to have very different perspectives of whether we want to keep everything the same and just try to switch things, or whether people are talking about deeper social, cultural change, whether we actually want people to have local energy systems and know where their energy comes from and thinking about how much energy they use all the time and being way more efficient and being involved in creating jobs in energy locally. There's a lot of different more radical changes that could be associated with renewable energy transition. So this is again just showing this tension between centralization and decentralization. An example of a decentralized proposal that has been put forward is this Desertec idea, which is talking about solar, large-scale solar in North Africa that could power all of Europe. Obviously, there are lots of ethical and colonialization problems with this kind of a proposal, but there are people seriously considering these kinds of different scenarios of how what the renewable energy or smart grid system could be. Yes. Yeah, so the question was, what if they were able to do this in a way that benefited the people who lived here, right? There's a lot of what ifs with a lot of these kinds of ideas, right? And a lot of there are a lot of unintended consequences that are hard to predict, but there's also security risks here. If there's only, one main transmission line that brings all of this electricity, if there was some kind of a disruption in that one line, it's not a very resilient system too. So there's questions to do with resilience, and kind of the modularity of having more local, decentralized systems also offers some security benefits too. Centralized? Yeah, well, we have, our current energy system is quite centralized, I guess, but there's increasingly more decentralization coming into the system. But fossil fuel systems, almost by definition, are often somewhat centralized because they often need to transport the fossil fuels, and that is a tricky aspect. So yes. So I just wanted to highlight a few of the points that we came up with in our book. And one of the big ones is the multiple opportunities for broader civic engagement in energy system change. And this relates to what you guys are here doing in this class, Energy Action Seminar. You're actually thinking about being engaged and involved in energy system change. And we often think about energy system change very much in terms of engineering. And but there's so much more beyond the technical details that is involved here. And so I just wanted to emphasize that point, that we really want to broaden energy education beyond engineering. And energy studies should really become more socially oriented, interdisciplinary, and more inclusive in terms of who's thinking about energy. Because organizations throughout society are going to be thinking about energy more and more. And we need all kinds of people to be interested and engaged in energy, not just engineers. So I also wanted to highlight and kind of set you up for next week's talk, where you're going to hear from somebody who's very familiar with the German energy transition. And if you compare Germany and the United States, you can think that in the United States, Germany has a national commitment to renewables, right? And you'll hear more about that next week. In the United States, we really don't. We have an all-of-the-above energy policy. We are simultaneously encouraging and subsidizing fossil fuel development, and we are also promoting renewable energy, right? So it's not as clear shift from one to another. It's kind of like, let's just do as much as we can in energy in all areas. So that is a difference between Germany and the United States. Within the United States, we also have a lot of heterogeneity, right? Each of the states in the United States is very different. So you're going to be hearing a lot more about Vermont. Vermont is really a leader in energy policy. We have this comprehensive energy plan, 90% renewables by 2050, very ambitious. And it doesn't just include electricity, it also includes heating and transportation. There's also Efficiency Vermont, which is a very progressive way to encourage efficiency And we have Green Mountain Power, which you're going to hear the CEO of Green Mountain Power, a very progressive, the largest utility, electric utility in Vermont, is coming to speak with you guys. There's also town energy committees. Many towns in Vermont actually have energy committees where people volunteer their time and meet in the evenings and weekends to talk about energy system change in Vermont. So there's a lot of really innovative things happening in Vermont. Texas, on the other hand, is a policy laggard. I mean, they don't have specific climate energy policy that's promoting renewables explicitly, but they, as I mentioned before, they have a whole economy set up to profit from energy. And therefore, they actually have had huge amounts of wind deployment, and mostly all economically motivated. People are making a lot of money on wind in Texas. Texas is also proud to be the largest producer of energy and the largest consumer of energy. They are actually very inefficient in the energy they use, and they use a lot of energy. So there's some distinctions there. Yeah. Yeah. Well, the ecological and economic considerations are intricately connected, because how you can make money, you also want to be thinking about sustainability. And with the concerns about running out of fossil fuels, there are actually, there is some connections there. So I wouldn't say it's all, yeah. So I just wanted to highlight yesterday, or is this 2 days ago, there was a big article in the Christian Science Monitor, which is an internationally read, about how Vermont became a clean power powerhouse. So Vermont is starting to get recognition about its unique position and ambitious goals in renewable energy. I think I already talked about that. As I mentioned, one of the really interesting organizations in the state of Vermont is Green Mountain Power. And this is Mary Powell, the CEO. It was coming, I think, in the end of October. And this is a really interesting organization because they are projecting real deep changes, and they're very interested in the encouraging distributed energy, which is, for most utilities who are used to providing energy, that hasn't been the priority. Right? A lot of utilities don't want people to get solar on the rooftop because it means they will be buying less electricity from the utility. So there's these tensions, but this is a really progressive organization, and they are a B Corporation, which is the first electric utility to be a B Corporation. B Corporation is a kind of like a labeling, like an organic label for food. For corporations, there's B Corporation, which is a certain kind of organization that puts rigorous standards of performance, accountability, and transparency, and alleviating poverty and addressing climate change and strong local communities as priorities of the organizations. Yeah?
Space goals for renewable energy.
Yes.
I just wondering, real quick, I get your take on how you feel about carbon tax.
Carbon tax.
Like a carbon tax.
Yeah. So putting some kind of price on carbon is assumed to be kind of a critical step in incentivizing this renewable energy transition. Because right now, we emit carbon into the atmosphere when we burn fossil fuels, but we don't have to pay for it, right? So it's an externality, it's pollution, and we are paying for it indirectly, but it's not integrated into our decision making. So yes, some kind of a carbon tax, a price on carbon is often considered and is an essential part of incentivizing and moving us to the next level of the renewable energy transition. Yeah. Okay, yeah. I know there are lots of things we could stop and talk about. So let me just quickly go through the last couple slides because there's a few interesting key points about new stuff that I also want to introduce to you guys before we take more questions. So you're going to hear more about Germany and the United States throughout, and especially next week about Germany. But I wanted to highlight one thing, thinking about energy consumption, because a lot of the discussion in energy is about generating electricity from renewables, right? We think about renewable energy transition, we think about generating the electricity. But we also want to be thinking, as I mentioned, about the consumption piece. And so these are just some comparison numbers about how much energy we use. And you can see that compared to Germany, United States averages are much higher. So I did also want to mention that Richard and I participated, and UVM was a co-sponsor of a workshop that was with collaborators from Germany and other parts of Europe and other United States scholars, and a workshop thinking about the energy transition with thinking about sustainable consumption and how much we actually consume, not just energy, but also stuff. Right? Because we're in a very high consumption-oriented society. And there are a lot of researchers who are very interested in exploring what are the opportunities for connecting and thinking about renewable energy transition and consuming less energy, but also consuming less all kinds of stuff. Because a lot of the stuff that we buy requires energy to transport it and to manufacture it. So there's a lot of potential here for real, deeper social and cultural change. I did just want to highlight here, this is Richard and me with a couple of our other colleagues.
Energy work is fun.
Yeah, and you can't see in that picture, but you can see in this picture, see these wind turbines in the back? And this is Miranda, who is coming next week, who she participated in this workshop, and that's where we met her, and Richard invited her to come to speak to you guys during this workshop, and she said, oh, I'd love to come to Vermont. So it should be really interesting to hear directly about the German energy transition next week. So one of the things at that workshop that we really wanted to focus on is energy demand. In energy policy, we tend to often think about energy demand as we always need to meet demand, right? Whatever demand is, we have to meet it. We don't want people to have blackouts. We don't want there to be problems in electricity. We want to always meet demand. But variability of energy demand is acknowledged, but it's often considered predictable, stable, and unresponsive to influence. There is some innovative research, including some done here. Dan Fredman is doing research here in Vermont on how to think about human behavior and changes in energy demand. But a lot of that work is limited, and it's often kind of on this incremental scale, right? Thinking about, okay, what can we do to get people to use a little bit less? Run their dishwasher later or earlier or whatever, which is great, and it's really important. But there are some real deeper conversations about deeper social and cultural change to reduce our consumption of energy and other stuff that I think we really need to have as part of the renewable energy transition. So I want to end with just a few some provocative thoughts about the future of energy and this transition. One of the things I wanted to mention, which I said before at the beginning, is always be wary about projections. In a rapidly changing world, they're almost always wrong. And a lot of times they're assuming business as usual. And we know business as usual isn't going to just keep going and going indefinitely. It's physically impossible, right? So some things are constantly changing. So that's one thing to think about. The other thing I want you to think about is democratization and decentralization of energy and the potential for more radical revolutionary change here. Power is centralized, not just in the grid, but control, management, and influence is concentrated among some very few powerful energy companies. Those companies actually have a lot of influence on our political system, more than we even recognize or realize. And we still have lots of fossil fuel subsidies in the United States and in other countries too, which are actually regressive because when you subsidize fossil fuels, you are actually encouraging and giving kind of breaks to companies that are already profiting a lot, right? So it ends up being a regressive situation. Fossil fuel industry is really strong. You may have heard about the divestment movement that is growing and where they're asking for organizations and universities and others to really think hard about, do we want to invest in fossil fuels? There's also a growing social movement for local community control. And another area that I've started to pay attention to just from being in the energy sector for over 10 to 15 years is a gender imbalance. There's energy systems decisions are predominantly made by men. And so one of the questions is, how could diversity in who's involved in energy systems change things? So I want to just make a point about this gender issue, because it's something that is something that I've actually become more attuned to the more I look into it. So this is a conference that I went to, which is typical. Obviously you can't see the specific people who are at the conference, but as I said, there's a lot of white men involved in energy work. And in general, there is a lot of research on diversity that highlights that diversity strengthens organizations, communities, sectors, and encourages innovation. So in and of itself, we know in a very abstract way that having more diversity can encourage change and innovation. But I also want to push a little farther and give you a few examples of why gender may actually be more important than you might have thought. This is risk perception research from 2000. This is a risk perception expert who looked at all kinds of things. These are all, you can't see all of them, but all kinds of risks. And they came up with the white male effect. In general, this is the line of how risky white males think different things are. This is slight risk. This is high risk. Here we have climate change and coal, oil burning plants. And then you have white women are the diamonds here, and men who are not white are also over on this level, this side. So the point being here is that there is, on average, a tendency for white males to not be as worried or concerned about these risks. They think and this is obviously on average, and this is risk perception research that you can go into in more details, but this gives us some evidence to also justify the idea that it might be actually really important to have more women and more non-white people involved in energy system change. Finally, another related comment. You may have seen this in the New York Times this summer. There was a whole article about how cold offices are. They're frigid, especially for women. Women resting metabolism rate is actually lower than men. And the formula that has been used for decades on what to set air conditioning of office buildings is based on men's metabolism. So a lot of people are cold in office buildings in the summer because things are over air conditioned. I don't know why, I've never understood this, but it continues. And it was just research that was published this summer that highlighted this bias toward men's resting metabolism that is the reason why. And so imagine how much energy and inefficiency is wasted here with just over air conditioning office buildings. So that's another specific example of why gender might be something that we should be paying a little bit more attention to. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say that there's lots of opportunities for expanding energy research, teaching and learning, and you guys all being in this class is a great contribution to that. And Richard putting on this class and inviting all these great speakers and really exposing you to such diversity of ideas is really, really valuable. I also wanted to connect this with thinking about universities in the renewable energy transition. Not only do we teach unique courses on energy and do research, but we also, our campus itself is a model for society. We can do things on campus that we can't necessarily do in other communities. And we also want to engage with outside the university. So there are a lot of new ways that universities and those of us who work and study in universities can engage on these issues. So I really encourage you to get involved, take advantage of the field trips and the other opportunities that you have in this class, and really get out there and connect with people on these issues. So the energy landscape is rapidly changing. If you play by the same rules and the landscape changes, it doesn't work so well, right? This is a soccer field, And if you try to play soccer on this court, this field, it won't work, right? Because the landscape is not conducive to those rules. So we all have influence. The social part may be more important than the technical. And everyone is involved, so be aware and engaged. I'd like to acknowledge my own research. A lot of the funding has come from the National Science Foundation's Science, Technology, and Society program, and my growing UVM Energy Climate Transitions research team. I work with a lot of great students, both graduate and undergraduate level, and you can check out my website for other publications if you're interested in more specifics on any of this stuff. So thank you.
You guys, we got 10 minutes or so. Questions, comments?
Yes.
And go ahead.
With the studies you showed us from the gender and race peers, do you think that we should start looking at helping third world countries to become more renewable because they might be more open to it than first world countries would be? And since they are growing like some certain populations, it would be better to help them out.
Absolutely, there's a lot of opportunities for renewable energy in communities throughout the world. And they're different, there's a lot of local, social, appropriate context for different kinds of technologies. But a lot of places are reliant on fossil fuel systems, and it's very expensive, very dirty, and unhealthy, but it's the only option for a lot of places, right? So there's huge potential. But there's also a lot of places that are remote villages that actually do use renewables, right? Because it's actually easier and more sustainable and self-sufficient than relying on fossil fuels. So one of the speakers coming, I think in November, is going to talk about energy in South Africa, in informal settlements, and it's obviously a totally different context than what we are typically thinking about. So hopefully you'll get some exposure to thinking about the energy system change potential in different places. But absolutely, there are opportunities for renewable energy in every context. Good. Yeah.
What do you think the role of news media, specifically satirical news, like Daily Show or late night shows, is given that a lot of youth college students, a little bit older, like watch these shows primarily as their source of information and influencing climate change?
Yeah, so some of the best news pieces that I've seen on climate change have been like Jon Stewart, right? He's done amazing things kind of making fun of the climate deniers, right? It's almost ridiculous, the level and extent to which elected officials are obstructing the scientific evidence and trying to confuse people that this isn't something that we need to pay attention to, right? So there's a lot of potential there, and obviously getting younger people to engage on these issues. So I'm sure maybe you've seen some and you agree with me. Maybe it's a leading question, but yeah. Yes.
And I was wondering what you think about having it being hit in the private sector, because some people have been instances where corporations or businesses or experience financing in the private sector have been trying to be in that sense. And I think my understanding of it is misleading, because although it's really nice, when this private sector carbon tax was implemented in France, to lie about it, to get more of those tokens and trade, and it created more, right? So it's like, what about like significant on the private sector versus government restricted?
Okay. So the question was about the carbon tax and public versus private in carbon tax. So there is a speaker coming later in the semester who's going to talk a lot more about carbon tax in specific. And there's a lot of complexities with accounting for carbon. But at a very fundamental level, there needs to be some economic incentives for us to care about carbon emissions, because right now there isn't, right? So that's the basics. In terms of implementation, it all depends on how it's done, right? And that's what you're talking about, some examples of potentially mechanisms for carbon trading or carbon accounting that don't necessarily lead to the changes that are intended, right? So there's a lot of complexities in all of this architecture and structure and implementation that all gets into very specific details in terms of implementation to make sure that those are effective. So I think that's a more sophisticated area, and it's hard to talk about in general terms, yeah. But I encourage you to look into that more, and you'll hear more about that with the speaker who will talk about carbon taxes in more detail.
Policy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you know if there's any big difference between that cultural willingness to have a energy transition between kids our age or like around our age and adults?
Yeah, good question. I guess I don't have off the top of my head like a research study that demonstrated that, but I know anecdotally that there's a lot of interest in renewable energy among youth and you know, younger adults. So you know, there is, I think as people get older, you know, they have less future that they're concerned about. You know, they're concerned about their grandchildren or children, and they're also thinking about kind of stability in a different way. When we're younger, we're still open to thinking about the future in very different ways. So, I mean, there's some inherent kind of benefits there in terms of thinking about radical versus incremental change and this revolution-evolution idea. So yes, there's a lot. And the other thing to consider is jobs. I mean, there is so much potential for jobs and engaged professional opportunities associated with all of these areas. And there's no scenario in which renewable energy jobs are not going to increase, right? So very practically, professionally, you should be you know, thinking about these kinds of issues, and climate change and sustainability issues. As I mentioned, every organization is going to be increasingly, every community, at multiple levels are going to be increasingly having to deal with issues of climate change and sustainability and energy. So, you know, there's so much potential just very practically for all of you to be thinking about how you want to engage with that.
You guys feel like you are more able to adapt than your parents, I guess? I think you are.
I think there was a question over here. Yeah.
I noticed on your first, or like one of your first slides, reference Grid Alternatives, the nonprofit.
Yes.
Are you like involved with them in any way?
I'm not. I am a strong supporter of them. Do you know that organization? Okay, so let me just go back. That's actually the very first slide. Grid Alternatives. They are a really cool organization
What did you do?
that,
We learned how to install solar panels on like 2 or 3 different houses, and me and a group of like 6 other students from UVM, they raised money to buy solar panels, and we put them on low-income houses for kids.
so Grid Alternatives is an organization, as far as I know, you probably know more, that focuses on the potential for urban and low-income jobs and opportunities and engagement with renewable energy installation and deployment and benefits, thinking very explicitly about how social and socioeconomic inequalities can be ameliorated through the renewable energy transition. So some really impressive work, and I've just been impressed by everything I've read about what that organization is doing. So that might be a great thing for you to share with the other people in the class in terms of these, if you had an internship or opportunity with them, because they're mostly in California and New York, but they're trying to expand into New England. So, yeah. Do you have a question?
Good question, but a key part of your talking about this energy transition was talking about changes in consumption patterns. And in terms of just bounded by the United States, what are some key leverage points in terms of effectively getting Americans to consume less energy? Or what areas where energy consumption is possibly best directed?
Yeah, great question. I would say transportation is huge, right? We are so reliant on cheap gasoline to drive ourselves independently in our cars everywhere we need to go. And if with a carbon tax, that price would go up and we'd think about each of our trips we make in a car more acutely, right? So that's huge. I think associated with that is size of homes. There's been a trend with these McMansions, with big, huge suburban homes that often only have 2 or 3 people living in them, with multiple bathrooms and huge houses, and it's nice and but it's a luxury. And as we think about the global population, and we think about growing inequities, we want to be thinking about our consumption and what that impact all of those choices that we make have on other people, right? We're not used to thinking about it that way. Another key thing is I was going to say conventional assumptions of growth and always, a lot of our economic policy is trying to encourage us to actually buy more stuff and buy bigger houses and new cars and new everything and new iPhone every year and all this stuff. And that's considered a good, the economy's picking up. But at some point, again, we're going to see more economic crashes because we know that we can't just keep going like that. And so at some point, we want our economic systems to be more based on human well-being and thinking about the distribution and inequality of human well-being, and not just that the rich people can keep buying more and more stuff and other people are more desperate, right? So there's a lot of leverage in thinking about bigger kind of economic system change that gets, that politically is really hard to talk about. Maybe all the way in the back there?
What would be the approach to convincing the behemoths of society to stop consuming that much energy? So even for someone like me, is sometimes I may be in the house and I'm like, hey, I don't care, I can pay for it. So how do you go ahead and get people to stop thinking like that?
Yeah. So that's a great question to end on, because it actually gets to the role of the individual versus the role of the whole system, right? We can each make our own choices, but we live within a broader system that's encouraging us that's really kind of pushing us to make decisions that are conformity within our system, right? So, each of us individually can make different choices, but that isn't the answer, right? There has to be a bigger system change for there to be real impact. And that's where it has to get into politics. It has to get into economic policy. It's nothing, each individual, you want to do, minimize your own carbon footprint or whatever, but we also are part of the system, and we can't, if you want to function and you want to be productive and you want to do the things that you're supposed to do for your job or for your education, you don't want to necessarily make all those decisions to minimizing your carbon footprint isn't going to be your priority. And same with me. I study this stuff, and I, fly and travel, and I make other decisions that are not necessarily always the best. So that's where you have to really encourage and engage with broader than yourself, right? Engage with your community, with your political system, and with the economic system that our political system encourages and perpetuates. So it's bigger than any individual. You want to really work as a advocacy coalition, right? Or collaboratively, you want to engage together to really make bigger change.